Good day, my Telos podcast friends. This is one of the most groundbreaking, interesting Telos podcasts to date. I'm so pumped on this podcast. So we talked about tools to build communities and allocate resources and make decisions. And we talked about things that are actually happening, boots on the ground, communities that are being built around this new tech. And it is just fantastic. We even have some people on the show today that went to jail trying to implement these types of strategies. Not only is the boots on the ground implementation interesting, but the theory is just of money and how it works in communities. This podcast is one to listen to a few times. I'm going to re-listen to it myself, which I rarely do. So today's podcast is brought to you by Crown.Club, which is a fantastic community. Speaking of communities, check out the Crown token, and as well our sound engineer Scott from Hybrid.Games. Check that out as well. So without further ado, let's get into this. Let's welcome to the show Jeff Emmett, Griff Green, and Will Ruddick.
You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain.
The Telos Podcast.
You stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
We are live. Let's talk about blockchain for good and the common stack and where that came from and what it means. So Griff, can you tell a little bit about the story of common stack and what it is?
Yeah, Common Stack is trying to align incentives for nonprofit causes so that people who are trying to create a collective good, they're rewarded when they make good decisions, and they're actually also, I don't want to say punished, but they're incentivized to make good decisions, and if they make bad decisions, they actually lose money. So this is a huge problem with it's inefficiencies of government and charities right now, is that the decision makers have no skin in the game. If you make a good decision and your charity, succeeds at its and benefits, that's great. You feel value internally, but on the economic plane, there's no real incentives, and so that's a missed opportunity, really. Whereas in the private sector, that's pretty normal. Like everyone has shares, and if you make good decisions and your company grows, then you make money as an individual. And that's really the core of what the Common Stack is trying to do, is to align incentives so that when the community succeeds, the individual succeeds. When the community fails, the individual also fails.
Wonderful. Yeah, this is like that bigger picture blockchain for good, like a solution to make communities function again as they kind of used to. We used to have these incentives between human beings where in smaller communities where we can hold each other accountable, but that has gone out the window with modern technology. So this is what a huge and interesting problem to tackle that has so much good kind of laced in there. What's your take on it, Jeff?
Yeah, I was just going to add that blockchain tech kind of brings this new trustful nature of online interactions to bear. So we essentially, our goal with the Common Stack is to use this new technology, this new toolkit to maybe scale is the wrong word, but to facilitate trust between members of a community that may not be locally. It could be for a local region, but it could also be for global causes, things like climate change or global trash cleanup. We see these as really important large-scale coordination issues that are not currently being resolved quickly or effectively enough by, coordination between nation states or various, multilateral agreements are having a really hard time to coordinate change on that scale. I mean, we're not starting there, obviously. That's a long way from where we are today. But essentially, what we're trying to do today is build this like minimum viable commons, basically improving the signal processing and decision-making powers of a community around shared goals. And if we figure if we can create these small-scale economies that work for communities, perhaps they can work for communities of communities and create kind of larger coordination mechanisms around some of the big problems we face in the world today.
Yeah, just to jive off that a little bit, it's like these economies exist. There are donors putting in money. there are decision makers making decisions on how to spend that money, and then that money goes out to individual projects. The Common Stack, our first approach at aligning incentives, is just to encircle that economy with what we call an augmented bonding curve, a token bonding curve, where if the internal economy grows, then everyone succeeds. If that internal economy shrinks, if there are fewer donations coming in, there's fewer projects getting funded, then the people that are making decisions, end up losing funds as well. Now, of course, this is the best part about the Common Stack is anyone who's losing money in the Common Stack is effectively just donating to the cause. So it's really easy to say, oh, they lose money because, well, the default standard in the nonprofit sector is people lose money. Everyone is losing money whenever they participate. So you just get basically the default.
And is that it sounds like Will has been involved in rural Kenya with the Red Cross and kind of a grassroots movement. So is that one of your inroads there?
Yeah, I mean, I would say from our side here in Kenya, I mean, we're using a very sort of like the most simple bonding curve that you could sort of use, and giving people the ability to basically put in a common pool of resources, and donors can put that in, the community can put that in, and they basically create what I would call shares essentially of that common pool. And it's sort of like investing into a local economy. So if I go in and put my money into this contract, well, I get to mint some additional shares, and I actually raise the share value of the entire community. It's sort of like there's a house there, and if someone goes and adds a new paint job on the house, everyone's shares, imagine 20 people own shares of that house, everyone's share value goes up, and vice versa. If I'm going to start burning those shares and pulling out the asset behind it, I lower the value of those shares. And so this concept of kind of running an organization or a community group based on this bonding curve basically means that there's always the secondary market where people can be pulling out reserves when they need them or putting more reserves in. And then there's a local market of the usage of these currencies. And so in Kenya, there's just no money in huge parts of the year. There's just the markets kind of collapse. All the money ends up kind of funneling back to Nairobi, it's a big city, and people are left with goods and services, but actually no medium of exchange. And so using these shares basically gives them a medium of exchange. So they're trading school fees, and I think this last year we've had about 8,000 users sign up, and those are all kinds of businesses, women selling vegetables and schools, and there's been about like $200,000 of transactions, about 90,000 actual transactions, and it's all transparent on blockchain that you can see. And so it's a whole new realm for Red Cross and aid organizations to really understand and support economies and really be a shareholder, like to really have teeth in the game. You don't just throw money at a community and walk away. This is a way they can basically kind of like stay invested in that community. And even have negative feedback, pull out their investment if it's not needed, or the aid's not going to where they think it should be going. It gives them a lot of transparency. So it's been very practical, and we're just still in the baby steps now of sort of going to the next stages of these things, and it's going to be a very exciting year, 2020, because of all that. So I'm super excited about all this stuff. That the Common Stack stuff is really it's kind of like it's what we needed in terms of our next steps. Like, how do we actually build governance into these things and all that?
Yeah, and I just want to say Will Ruddick is the man. He has this amazing documentary on YouTube. If you want to check it out, it's like half an hour. He has been killing it in Kenya for 10 years, creating local currencies. And I don't know of any project in the blockchain space that has been as successful at actually reaching people on the ground and getting them to use blockchain tech with feature phones, with normal dumb phones. People are sending community currencies, blockchain-based community currencies to each other, and they're using bonding curves in Kenya right now in small villages. It's mind-blowing. It's really incredible.
That is incredible. What's the name of Will's documentary for people who are listening?
Will, what's the name?
I don't know.
I usually just search Will Ruddick YouTube. It's
Okay.
the first thing that comes up. He's a dreamboat on there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Will Ruddick YouTube. All right. Fantastic. Can you give a user experience explanation? I know you mentioned like a woman selling vegetables, kind of what that looks like, how the blockchain plays in and how they're using it, boots on the ground.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So, I mean, implementation wise, like when we go into a new area, we do a huge kind of airdrop into that community. So basically, like everyone, to sign up, they just, any little Nokia button phone, they dial what's called a service code or a short code. So it's like *384, and they get this little menu that pops up, and it asks them to sort of, register who they are and whatnot. And then after that process, they get automatically 400 tokens, and each of those tokens is basically pegged to the Kenyan shilling, but softly pegged on a bonding curve. So initially it's 1-to-1 with the Kenyan shilling, and they just start trading that. So we work with the chief and the elders and everyone in the village to just get used to using that system. So they've got this, $4 on there. Generally, there's some schools we're working with, or like cooperative businesses that are always accepting these things. They're sort of like the backer of last resort. And then those currencies start to pool those. So we basically issue a sort of a vanilla currency. We call that sarafu, which actually means currency in Swahili, out to the community. That's backed up. It has this reserve of. We're using a synthetic Kenyan shilling. So basically, we're using DAI right now as the funding, as the reserve, and then we basically create a Kenyan shilling out of that DAI. That's pegged to the Kenyan shilling. And so people, when they want to, there's a rule on how quickly they can basically withdraw those funds. So if you're holding those tokens, you have a claim against those reserve tokens, right? And you can pull those out using M-Pesa, which is like an e-money system here. And so we're working with an organization called Sempo, and they're doing all the kind of cash and payment rails in and out of local money here in Kenya, up to the blockchain and back. So essentially, it begins as sort of this barter network of just people getting used to using these tokens. And then what happens is that community groups, and usually these are groups of like 25 women that are doing savings and loan informally with each other. What they do is they start collecting these things and start saving them and start loaning them back out. They start using them as they were using Kenyan shillings. And as they do that, if they get up to 10,000 of these tokens, which is like $100, which also like Red Cross can come in and support, they can now create their own, what we call these as community inclusion currencies, CICs. So basically what they do is they take, $100, which can be donated or, partially from them as well. They store that into a fund, which we call kind of like a trust fund, but it's one of these reserves. And then they essentially leverage that into these shares. And we do 4x leverage. So there's a kind of 25% reserve ratio in order to have a 1-to-1 exchange rate. And so basically for $100, they're creating 400 tokens, each equal to $1 initially. And as a holder of those starts to trade them in the community, well, there's no change to that exchange rate. But as soon as someone starts cashing them out, well, they're removing some of that asset. And so they make all the shares drop in price. And then there's an advantage for the community to buy back in, right? Because let's say the price goes down to $0.50. So for $1, then I can get 2 of these tokens. And as long as there is that local backing, there's an advantage to doing so. And that raises the price back up again. So it's sort of arbitrage in this case, sort of is one of the stabilization mechanisms. And this, all these smart contracts were originally, put on smart contracts by Bancor. And so we've kind of just forked that Bancor smart contract and gotten rid of BNT as the reserve currency and just replaced it with DAI.
Interesting. And you mentioned the backer of last resort. You have a few people. So these kind of parts of the community have agreed to continually back this? And then is the Red Cross working with them to make sure that they kind of have the support to continue to back, be the local exchange for the currency?
Well, okay, so like the savings groups themselves, like this group of 25 women, when they'll issue like a loan to their members with these currencies, and they will demand them as repayment, right? And so in a way, they're just the repayment and the savings itself is in a way a backer. Everyone knows they need that the next week, like they're saving like $1 to $2 worth, every week. And so that fills back up that reserve as well. So that's one of the default ones. And otherwise, like those groups of 25 women, they run businesses. And so they have, they run, cooperative maize mill. They all have their own businesses. And so those all also end up becoming backers of last resort because they also need it to repay and do their savings group stuff. So that's in general it. I mean, we don't want to be in a situation where like, the aid money that comes in from Red Cross, ideally that's, it's seeding, it's going in, it's giving them a seed to start creating these reserves and creating that share value. And then Red Cross can trickle in, more depending on, we're kind of doing this sort of thing where you have a parameterization of all the trade that's going on. So, let's say Red Cross or other donors are focused on education of young women, or food security or health related issues, or WASH, or like water related outcomes and sanitation, stuff like that. So they can basically say, okay, we have this money for this. Let's look at the transaction data and use that to be intelligent about understanding the economy in general, but also being able to target, a particular intervention. Because right now, like a lot of the money, it's not, well, one, it's not really being tracked at all. It's hard to track anyways. And they're raising something like $30 billion a year right now, and it's costing them a lot of money to do so in the first place. So if they can bring in people to sort of invest into these communities, and they can see themselves as sort of an investor into these local economies, and even bring in things like private equity into these, then they have a whole nother way of trying to raise capital, because they're looking for trillions of dollars to look at refugee crises and all this kind of stuff. So the 30 billion that they're raising right now, which is also costing them, for every dollar they raise, they're spending probably 40 cents on that dollar just to raise that dollar. That's all the ads they do and all that kind of stuff too. So if there can be a more efficient way for them to raise capital so that they can support communities, and be intelligent about what they're doing with that, and transparent to the public as well of, where is that money going? What is it doing? Can we see, your dollar coming in? Can we see it kind of being leveraged in that community? Can we see this multiplier effect? So that's kind of the claim here, is to basically that, we're doing a 4x multiplier on the money itself, and then we're doing something like at least a 5x multiplier in terms of trade velocity compared to the national currency. And there's a whole bunch of work right now in terms of analyzing the data from the last year, and then we're working with Block Science, some of these guys that Jeff and Griff work with as well, and to model all this stuff and sort of like pull in a lot of this stuff from Common Stack and saying, okay, we've started with this kind of vanilla smart contract that we've kind of forked from the Bancor protocol. What's next? How do we ensure that a big supporter can't just cash out all their tokens tomorrow and drop the token price too fast, and things like that.
And with that, Will, so the 4x makes sense, right? Because you put money in the bonding curve, its reserve ratio is 25%, and then you get, for every $100 you put in, you get $400 out. But for the 5x, right, the fact that it's a local currency in a way makes it stay in the currency. Can you just dive into that a little bit more?
Sure. I mean, so one, there's no transaction fees. For them to trade amongst each other and, have that local demand for these, like, let's say, with these savings groups, it's a lot cheaper than having to cash these things out, right? So if you want to cash them out, well, one, you're going to go into whatever the market price is, And, if that market price is above the shilling, then yeah, there's an advantage to cashing it out then, but that'll quickly go under a shilling. And just the effort to do so, because you're cashing it out into e-money. So that's pretty ubiquitous in Kenya. But still, there's transaction fees on e-money now that's run by the telecoms here and stuff like that. So there's a lot of cost to having to cash out of the system. So it's way cheaper to stay in the system. And there's a huge amount of goods and services that are available, and there's a huge demand for those. There's just no medium of exchange. And so the idea is, that 4x multiplier meets a market that's already ready for it. And as long as it stays in that market, well, they're getting maximum liquidity and maximum value out of that. As soon as they start popping out of that market to, let's say, there's certainly stuff they have to import, like right now, like, petrol for their motorcycles and things like that. So, there's a premium, there's a cost to leaving that market. But then that also, there's that advantage to buying back in. And so there's this kind of, there's the market stabilization in terms of just, the circulation. There's also the fact that they're mixing these with Kenyan shillings on a purchase quite often. So like if the cost is 100 shillings and they only have 50, they're topping it up with, their local currency. And just by virtue of doing so, they're almost automatically pegging it to the national currency because it's too complicated otherwise.
And the national currency, that will just kind of leave the community, right? The national currency can just like flow back to Nairobi or wherever. And like those transaction fees on e-money and all those large companies, they're able to extract money out of the community, whereas the local currency kind of just gets stuck there, right? It just pools and circulates.
Yeah. I kind of think about it as like if you've got a faucet of water and you've got like a cup and you stick that cup at like 45 degrees under the faucet, well, like eventually it'll fill up with water and then you have some money just going, you have water just going at the same rate as it was before, but now you have all this circulation going on. So if you turn off that water, right, there's still some eddies in there. There's still some circulation in that cup. So in a way, I see the system, like the reserve system and even the bonding curve is sort of like creating that cup that's holding a little bit of that asset, right? So that if the water does turn off, there's still some left there. And the ultimate idea is that the source of that water coming into that community is actually just another community. And it's cups all the way around. It's like a whole circle of cups that are all feeding into each other, right? And so that's the cool thing about this is that every single community is creating their own currencies and they're all interoperable with each other automatically. And that's what's really cool about this is to have like a full decentralized system. So if, we've got Griff pays Griff money and Jeff money and Brandon money and Will money. Well, if I start buying a ton of stuff from Griff, well, what's really happening is I'm giving him some of that reserve. I'm making his currency a little bit stronger. Right, it's like importing from China. We're making the Chinese economy a bit stronger compared to the dollar, and that gives Griff an advantage to buy back from my community. And what's nice is that we're sort of like we're sort of mapping trade imbalance in a way onto pricing, along this bonding curve, and that creates this very transparent economic system that we right now it's totally obfuscated. If you look at worldwide economies and stuff like this, like what is the value of the US dollar? We don't know. It's the military. It's is it a share of something? We don't know. And so having this stuff on chain, being able to look and say what is that reserve, how much is in there, and then hopefully the next like 4 or 5 years is now playing around with all the voting and all this system, but also playing around what is that reserve? Instead of using DAI, can we be using things like futures contracts and trust lines? Like all that technology we should be able to use as a reserve system. And in a way, this bonding curve stuff is in a way more like a credit system. Yeah, he's got the trust lines shirt on. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I just want to underpin as well how revolutionary this could potentially be for global aid. So maybe to give a bit of context, when in the past, the Red Cross used to ship in food or clothes or medicines, realize that it's far more efficient to transfer cash to these communities, because if you send a whole bunch of clothes, you're just going to decimate the local, textile manufacturing industry kind of thing. So they've realized that it's much more effective to give people money, and their economy can just provide, we give people money and they can decide what they need. It's far more bottom up than these top down kind of aid structures of the 80s and 90s. So what Will is experimenting with right now is being on the cusp of, instead of just giving people national currency, because a lot of that national currency ends up flowing back through imports and exports to Mombasa, to Nairobi, to the big cities. When you enable the Red Cross to invest directly in a local complementary currency, you get that 4x multiplier on top of a 5x multiplier. This is like 20x improvement on local circulation of that aid. So this is huge. Like this is, they're also rolling out feasibility studies in a bunch of different places. And this is essentially what the Common Stack wants to do, is build these templates for complementary currencies to allow that kind of rich local currency velocity, while also allowing for liquidity to external markets and other currencies with protection as well. So you're preventing the extraction, the value extraction of traditional economies from just pulling all the value out of those local currencies through the design of the Common Stack components.
Yeah. So like once we sort of like really open this stuff up to like the world in a sense, because right now the systems we're working on, in some sense they're fairly managed. Like we're running basically a gateway server on top of a telecom that is waiting for these little feature phone messages to come in, right? So it's what's called USSD, unstructured supplementary service data, which it creates this little menu. We process that menu. We are holding the private keys and then sign those transactions onto the blockchain, right? And so, we can basically, in that system, we are sort of like the rules on terms of cashing out and stuff like this, we can basically code those in ourselves right now, but it's not yet on the blockchain, right? It's not in the smart contracts yet. And so, once this stuff sort of leapfrogs out of, these controlled environments that we're in right now, and into, everyone using their feature phone or, smartphone, and they're holding their own private keys, then, we need all these systems to basically be in place. And so that's kind of, the roadmap is sort of like this year, kind of doing all the modeling, getting all this stuff together, by the end of this year, having very good smart contracts, figuring out even, like right now we're on XDAI in terms of blockchain. Like, is that what we're going to be? Are we going to create nodes on that? So there's a lot of real questions of, like how do we think about scaling this? And with Red Cross, they've got, programs all over the world. They've got like 1.2 million employees. I think they're the biggest employer in the world. So for them to now say, okay, we've got all this social capital in places around the world, like, can we implement these systems all over the place? There's a lot of questions and a lot of that we're just barely even touching the surface of yet.
What's really exciting is the modeling. For me, this is the big revolutionary aspect, especially when you start bringing in token bonding curves. I imagine most people don't know what a token bonding curve is, so maybe I can just give like a quick explainer, because it's pretty mind blowing, right? So like if you let's talk Amazon stock for a second, right? So Jeff Bezos is the richest man in the world, right? He has $132 billion or something like that, right? Worth of Amazon stock. Now, does he really have $132 billion? Like, clearly he doesn't, right? If he sold all of it today, he wouldn't get $132 billion. And you see this across the board. You see houses with valuations, but and you could say, oh, the global housing market or the housing market in the U.S. has this much money in it. But if 5 houses in a neighborhood all try to sell at the same time, there isn't the liquidity to back it up, right? There's this what I call the market cap illusion, and this is what a lot of organizations live off of. This is what fintech startups like live off of. This idea that, hey, we can sell shares in our company in advance to investors, and then build a company that eventually people will want to buy, and then those shares would be worth something. But for now, they don't really have this liquidity. But anytime that this company wants to sell a share, they have to find somebody to buy it. And this is where normal markets get really difficult to model, because you never know what the liquidity is in a market. If someone wants to sell some financial instrument, the price isn't just clearly defined. It's kind of this magic invisible hand of like, the aggregated demand and aggregated supply of all of those fungible financial assets combine into a magical price, right? But with the token bonding curve, we can start pricing things in an algorithmic way. So instead of having to find someone to buy your financial asset, you can actually just destroy the financial asset or create the financial asset according to an algorithmic price that was predetermined. So we call these token bonding curves one-sided markets or automatic market makers. And so anytime someone wants to, if Jeff Bezos has 16% of all the value of a stock that's backed by a token bonding curve, he would know exactly how much that's worth. It wouldn't be the market price times the number of stocks, because there is slippage just like in normal markets, but that slippage would be defined. Because in a token bonding curve, to simplify it, you could imagine that every single token that exists has a price. The first token's price is like 1 penny. The 1,000th token is $1, and the 1,000,000th token is $10. And so you could kind of draw a curve and say, oh, well, you're buying the 500,003rd token, so that has this price. And you're selling the 500,003rd token, so it's that price. And that's the same price, right? But as the supply grows or shrinks, the price will change. So it still acts and responds to supply and demand. So what's really interesting, though, about a token bonding curve is that now that we have this token, it has infinite liquidity. It will always be able to be sold, even if no one wants it. If there's 100,000 tokens that exist and all of a sudden no one wants it, they can all be sold because they're all just burned into the token bonding curve, and the collateral that smart contract is holding is just given back to the people as they demand it. And what this allows, though, is for us to model systems, to model economies where we can say every agent's behavior, every interaction with that economy ends up resulting in a change in the price. And we can actually determine that change in the models with certainty. Because if you try to model economies in a real world today, right, it's incredibly impossible, because you have this regulatory agency that says you can't do X, Y, and Z, but then you have this open pool of people with money, and of course they can do X, Y, and Z. They don't care. They just have to not get caught by the regulatory agency. So, okay, well, that's really tough. And crypto helps solve that, right? Because now the regulation is in the code. Now the people can only call these functions, right? And so now you can start mapping behavior by formalizing what you put in this code in math and say, okay, these agents can only call these functions which have these results. So crypto gets rid of the regulatory agency. But you still don't know how these behaviors affect the price unless you integrate a token bonding curve in a correct way. Because you could make a token bonding curve in a way where it doesn't have a one-to-one mapping with agents' behaviors, but you can also make it so it does. So if you put this token bonding curve and design it so that anytime any agent's behavior occurs, it can be 100% determined. The price can be 100% determined. Now you can actually start having dynamic systems where, as the price changes, you can predictably, guess how agents will react to the price changing. Now you have a dynamic system that you can model, and we can start modeling economies like we build structures, like we build buildings. My little sister is an architectural engineer, and when they build buildings, when she designs buildings, she might make sure that she knows where the building will fail. She picks a point and she says, okay, it's going to fail here. I'm going to make this the weak spot. And I'm going to put these protections in so that if it does fail, then this is what will happen. Now, could you imagine if we could build economies that when they fail, we know where they will fail and we can put in protections so that it doesn't have a massive impact? Right? This is where we're headed. And what's really great is we're starting, at least Will and Common Stack and a few other groups, even Molecule, we're starting in the nonprofit space in a very safe environment where, if the economy fails, well, the economies of nonprofits have already failed. I'm sorry, the donors are just giving money and then the money gets spent somehow. It's not a very robust economy. When the money dries up, okay, the whole nonprofit cause fails. So if we start in a place that really needs this kind of modeling and this kind of structures, we can make a huge impact. And once this is figured out, it can actually start impacting the rest of the world in other economies.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, I guess I think Griff's point there was if bonding curves don't work at all, what we are ending up with is a total donation, which these things are already a donation is a total financial loss. You give money, 100% of it is gone. You do not see any return. So in the very worst case of a bonding curve applied to this kind of situation, we are basically where we're at today. What we're trying to do is say, hey, maybe if the Red Cross, or even expanding that to a global impact investment network, maybe myself sitting in Canada wants to see this local economy that Will Ruddick is kind of bootstrapping in Kenya. I can buy their local currency, or someday in the future, perhaps, I could buy their local currency, support their local economy, and also perhaps not see a 100% loss in supporting their economy. I mean, if I wanted it to be, that's fine. I can make a donation still, but perhaps I could reclaim 10% of that, or 20% of that, or 50% of that, or who knows? We're kind of questioning what impact investment can look like moving forward with experiments like this.
And it's not about the making of money. It's about the skin in the game and the incentivization to make good decisions, right? Like, we're not trying to say, oh, let's make it so you can make money in charity. No, that's not the point. The point is to get good decisions and to make it so that the decision making is decentralized in the first place. And that if people make good decisions, they're rewarded. And if they make bad decisions, they're punished. And it's not, but in the end, in the nonprofit space, that punishment means, oh yeah, your donations just went somewhere, as they usually do.
I think, there's this thing around, sorry, Jeff, so in Kenya in the last few years, we've had banks collapse, several times. And actually, one of our foundation's donations was in one of these banks, and it's a horrible situation. And basically, banks are on a very bad bonding curve. Essentially, it's a step function, right? So they basically say, I'm going to issue credit. And there's this regulation of how much, reserve, quote unquote, they're supposed to have. And there's really no real regulation around it, because it's something really hard to audit anyways. They can hold that in assets and derivatives and all sorts of stuff. And so they start over issuing credit constantly. And eventually in Kenya, they quite often are giving loans to their executive staff worth, millions of dollars and stuff like this. And the money doesn't really exist. They just created it on a ledger. And so what I would, coming from this world of community currencies, I was doing this well before blockchain existed, where communities were getting together and saying, hey, why don't we just make our own money? Why don't we, and so you start, which is awesome. It's an awesome concept. And I got super excited about it. And I was just like, fuck yeah, let's do that. And let's go to places where they don't have any money and let's fucking just print it. And so that's what I did. And, the government wasn't too keen on it when I first started doing it, but we got out of jail and did good stuff. But, the banks have a full license to continue printing money with almost no repercussions at all. I mean, the insurance that the central bank offers around it is extremely minimal, and it really doesn't actually even cover, a small fraction of it. And so how can we responsibly create money in the world? I mean, it's a huge question, right? This is all like quantitative easing or MMT, all these, there's a lot of theories out there. And there was this guy Hayek, which basically said that, well, why don't we just let private banks essentially and organizations all around the world to create money and create kind of competitive markets of those monies. And really the bonding curve idea basically says, well, we can do a much better and honest fractional reserve system globally. We can basically say, like, if I'm a bank, let's say I'm Wells Fargo, we all agree on some reserve currency, and we say, okay, well, Wells Fargo has to have on-chain X amount of DAI, for instance. They can create credit. We don't call that credit a dollar. We call it Wells Fargo dollars, okay? And Wells Fargo dollars, if they collapse, it's not going to take out the US dollar with it. It'll just take itself out, right? And second by second, you would know how valuable is a Wells Fargo credit. You would know that because you can actually see on the blockchain what's actually behind it. And that is what a group of 25 women in Kenya are doing right now in Kenya. They're more sophisticated than most central banks in the world right now, because you can actually see what the fuck is behind it. What is behind the money that they're printing, and they're trading it amongst each other, and it's essentially working right now. So I think it's amazing. It's crazy. And I think, as the world starts to get the idea of, whatever we start calling these things, I don't know if, we'll keep using the term bonding curve in another 5 to 10 years. Who knows? Yeah, exactly. There's too much bondage going on anyways.
Yeah, exactly. Put the whips away, man.
Exactly.
But
yeah.
I mean, this is the magic, though. People get to pick what currencies they want to use. And we got to accept, once we accept that fact, we can start creating our own currencies. We can have some competition here. And it doesn't have to be just like, oh, well, I have to pay taxes in this, so this is the money I use. I mean, there's so much value in value exchange itself that's just lost if you use someone else's currency. And what I hope beyond this, just like using someone else's currency, is that we can start creating currencies that change the story of money, the basic principles and foundations that we just accept, that money is always a scarce resource. And this, anytime you deal with money, you're dropped into a scarcity mindset, and all of a sudden it's fight or flight. Money just ruins relationships. And I mean, you can just imagine, if you had a money tree in your backyard, you'd build a fence. But if you have a fruit tree, you're passing the fruit out to all your friends. Money is just, it has a different story than a natural object. But that is just a story. The paper means shit. It's just a story in our heads. And now if we come to this awareness that, hey, we can create our own money. Now, we can just keep creating the same money, or we can start creating different money with different stories, that maybe has a story of UBI behind it, where it's just...
I think the bonding curve is the way to do that responsibly. That's the question. It's like, okay, Griff, you've got a money printing machine, and so does Jeff. How do we deal with that? Well, that's a problem if there's no contract, there's no protocol, there's no, how do we communicate with each other? And so the bonding curve is the way to connect and sort of, in a way, self-regulate. And so I see us as we're 1,000x more regulated than the banking system already, right? Because you can freaking see what's behind it at any second, and trade it with Jeff's currency, because relatively, my Griff, dollar is worth X amount of Jeff's, because I know what's behind them.
Yeah, it really makes explicit a lot of the things. A lot of people look at cryptocurrencies and bonding curves in particular and say, oh, it's a Ponzi scheme, where's the value behind it? It actually makes it very clear what value is behind it, compared to a lot of legacy financial instruments where we just assume Amazon has a whatever $1 trillion market cap, and Jeff Bezos owns 132 billion of that, whatever. As Griff mentioned, the first share he sells at that price would go at that price. The next one would be a little less. The next one would be a little less. And we have this same Ponzi-esque value creation, but it's just not transparent in our current system, so we don't even know it's there. There's been a ton of research into complementary currencies, and basically some very good scholars on this, basically saying, what we have in the world today is a currency monoculture, one national currency per country. Imagine if Canada said, we're only going to grow apples. Every tree has to be an apple tree, and no other trees are allowed, no other crops. Imagine the systemic risks there, right? If one pest, one climate change, maybe the climate of Canada warms by 1 degree and apples can no longer grow there, the whole country would be demolished. And this is what we're doing with our economic systems, is imposing these top-down monocultures of currency. And the potential for this is to allow multiple different, diverse, and also interconnected types of currencies to proliferate and really improve the resilience of our economic systems.
Not only that, the currency that we're imposing in this monoculture is completely owned, not by the communities themselves, not managed by a government. I mean, maybe slightly, right? Influenced by a government slightly, but it's managed by some Federal Reserve Bank style organization that, the government puts up a bond that says, hey, I'm going to pay you interest, bank, please make money for me. And then we are paying this organization to make money for us when we are just creating that bond out of nothing. That bond could just be money. We don't need that organization. We are a community of people. We don't need to pay someone to make money for us. We can make money as an organization ourselves, as a community ourselves. Like, at least if the government or the people were just creating money, that would be like, there wouldn't be national debt. There wouldn't be debt. Could you imagine if there's one way to get rid of the debt: stop paying the Federal Reserve to print money for us. Sorry, I'm an American, so I come back with that baggage. But if we as a communities can start making our own money, and we can change this debt culture. I mean, this is why I'm so excited. Obviously, bonding curves are a great way to keep things honest between competing currencies. But just like the trust lines, which has been mentioned a couple of times, which is a mutual credit system. Holochain has a lot of mutual credit systems where instead of money being created by some central authority, money is backed by trust. Like, I trust Jeff, so I'm going to create a line of credit between us of like $5,000. And if I don't know Brandon that well, but Jeff knows him really well. So if Brandon wants to spend money and to buy something from me, he can use this trust line I have with Jeff and the trust line that he has with Jeff to kind of like move money around. But now money would be created by trust. I mean, could you imagine that working in a place like Venezuela or in many parts of Africa where there's just not money? Like, crypto is not going to work that well. If you have like, hey, there's no money here. Well, then how are you going to buy Bitcoin, right? If you can create money backed by trust, that's just a new currency. Or you can create a UBI currency like Circles, or I'm sure there's dozens of UBI currency implementation out there where it's like, oh yeah, everyone gets a certain amount of money a day, and that's just how we create money. And the common stack strategy is saying, hey, let's create money that's backed by a desire for a public good, right? Anyone who wants to fund this public good, who wants to if people say, hey, we want family planning, we want, education for children, we want, roads, we want any nonprofit cause that can be freely accessible and support and abundant, right? Any cause that any group that's kind of trying to create abundance for everyone, we can create a currency around it that if people choose to support it, then it will grow. And this is the kind of innovation that can really take blockchain for good. That can really we can start using the technology to have an impact on societies. It just takes a little bit of creativity and stepping out of the box, and being like, oh yeah, stop being the fish swimming in money. And start realize that money is all around us, and it's very interesting and a complex topic. It's not just something that we're swimming in.
Yeah, we've really dumbed money down to just this idea of just this piece of paper that buys stuff, but it is this really kind of nebulous idea that there's so much more to it. I mean, money it doesn't have to be what it is right now. It can be just a way to facilitate these small communities like you're talking about. How sophisticated we've talked about the women in Kenya that are using this? How sophisticated does a user need to be to kind of implement this?
Yeah, well, Kenyans right now have already kind of leapfrogged most of the world. They're using e-money, on their phones, daily already. And generally, you've got X number of units on your phone, like let's say just with the e-money system, and you spend that, everyone knows the relative value of those things, like, how much is a fork cost and all this stuff, it's still denominated in Kenyan shillings. And so they're using those systems already all the time. So we've basically just copied the entire interface for how they're using e-money right now. And instead of the e-money, which is, basically just fiat, we've just replaced it with a token economy. And so they're using it in basically the same way. Now, what's new about it is that there is this floating exchange rate now, right? So there's a collateral fund essentially that they own in Kenyan shillings, and then they're trading these currencies around, and they do see, so in the interface they will see the price of their token going up and down, and there are savvy dudes in the community that are waiting for it to go up before they want to sell. So you do end up with this sort of like speculation into the local economy. We put very tight bounds on it. So it goes, from like, let's say 0.5 to like 1.5 in terms of, relative to the national currency. And so there's not a huge amount, but you see a little bit of that, but in general, they're just, like, I've got these units on my phone. I know I can spend them here to buy my flour. The guy who accepts them for flour is paying for some school fees. The teacher is buying some water from, a local supplier. The water guy, sends it back to someone for tomatoes, and it just keeps circulating like that. So most of the transactions we see are just that. And then, as people really need to pull out some Kenyan shillings, we see them doing so. And then, relative to how much Kenyan shillings is in their fund, right? So if the rate is quite good right now, you'll see more people pulling out Kenyan shillings, versus if the rate is very low, you'll see the opposite happening. People will be putting some more money into the system. So I don't think it's, all of these things, like we're in the process right now of writing new user guides and translating those into Swahili, and there's 42 other languages in Kenya as well. And it's sort of like we describing it quite often as like using terms like shares. Like you have a share in the economy, or you as a cooperative group, now you have a defined share structure that you never had before, right? And so that's an exciting thing for them. Like they sort of see themselves in a way as like a business that's sort of like on the stock market, and they all have stock in their collective asset. And I think that ownership concept for them is really exciting. They've never really owned anything in that way before. And for them to now be trading those shares around, has this secondary meaning. It's also like part of their identity. Like we did about 2,000 surveys last year, and we asked people, why are you using these things? And about 50% of them would say things like, well, it helps me save more of my national currency, or I'm getting higher turnover. Like they would essentially economic reasons. And the other half would say things like, it's my identity. It's like, it's part of belonging to this community. And it gives us, like they name them, for their, whatever they want to name them. So it gives them a sense of identity and belonging. And so like holding that share of the commons, and this kind of goes back to like, Jeff, you were talking the other day about like Oldstrom's, principles for managing a commons. Like you have to be able to define it. What is it? And who is managing it, and all that kind of stuff. So this, the idea of this kind of bonding curve produces this ability to sort of like own shares in something collective. And, that the value behind it, yes, we can peg it to some reserve in national currency, but there's also that whole social value behind it too, right? Like if the social value is not there, then it's not going to keep going anyways. Yeah, go ahead.
And people see this. You see this in crypto, right? This is like, we generally call it maximalism, right? You see the EOS maximalism, Ethereum maximalism, Bitcoin maximalism. But if you create a community currency, you're a community maximalist, right? If you create a currency that's trying to save the Amazon, you can become a save the Amazon maximalist. I will only work for a currency that's supporting the saving of the Amazon, you know?
Yeah.
And this is a huge power, and it's like one of the negatives of crypto is this maximalism attitude, but it's just a thing. It's a tool, and if you can do a little greed jujitsu, and you can turn that into like something positive, then you're winning. And you do that with speculation too, right? Well, like you're talking about, we don't want the speculation. It happens, but in your system, it's actually a very good thing. It helps balance the economy. It helps balance the price of these currencies. So these speculators, they're doing it out of their own self-interest. But because of the way the system's designed, it actually is a benefit for the community at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, even the aid industry, we'd like them to start thinking themselves as sort of more like impact investors. And even for an impact investor, like an investor, like, okay, you want to speculate in this economy by basically giving them a bunch of reserve, and you want to hold those tokens. And if that investment does well, it also means that there was demand on that economy, that the economy is doing well. So it's a total win-win scenario. So bringing in private equity and, trying to, there's this huge, like the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. They need something like, $2.6 trillion to even just start funding them at all. Like, where are we going to get that money? And if we're going to take it as loans from private banks, how would we pay back the interest on that? And, where does all that money come from? So, for us to sort of think about this as a way of tackling sustainable development goals and bringing in, investment into emerging economies and refugee crises, like employing refugees, using these currencies, like creating all the credit needed to start all these kind of regenerative economies, like doing forest conservation and, replanting forests and all that kind of stuff. Like, where do we find the funding for all this stuff? And how do we give, essentially, there's this sort of bridging that we need to do. It's like, well, there's a huge amount of dudes like Jeff Bezos in the world that, they're sitting on huge amounts of capital. What can we do to start moving that capital into places that we really need it right now? And so that, like getting those people to sort of invest, or those economies to sort of invest into these emerging economies that are doing good stuff, that are transparent, that you can actually see where all the money is going. That's a hope that, that's part of the hope in terms of bootstrapping into this next economy, is sort of how do we transition from the current one? And I, Zargam is one of these guys who always explains this as like a membrane, right? Like, how do we connect from these future economies like trust lines into the current economy? How do we make that connection? And so, like, even with trust lines, like the idea of saying, well, what if there was a bonding curve or collateral in national currency on your trust line? So if someone really does break trust, well, you still have a way out, in other words. And so, like, what's the worst case scenario in these? How do we connect those worlds together in a safe way?
Yeah, and I just wanted to touch on, or sorry, Brandon, did you have a question in particular about that, or?
Yeah, well, I'm just curious with the trust lines and how that kind of scales to, let's say, bigger loans for buying a house or something like that.
I wouldn't say that's its intention, right? Like, it's possible, like but it's not made for loans. It's made for mutual credit. So it's really the creation of money is backed by trust, and you have a lot of local currencies. Basically, everybody has their own unique currency, and so it's not meant to be used for loans. Like, you need a big currency to be doing big purchases, and these are lots of small currencies that just enable the individual to create money if they have trust, right? If people believe in them and their ability to support the community and to make a product that will add value to the community, then they can receive credit, or they can buy bread, or they can do what they need to do to have their minimum needs succeed. But if it's always a complementary currency, trust lines and mutual credit systems in themselves I don't see how they could become. I would love to hear somebody who believes this, because I'm sure somebody, maybe in the holochain community, can tell me like what the world would look like with the baseline currency being a mutual credit system. But all mutual credit systems are generally denominated in some other currency. So like you can't have, it's always going to be complementary, at least from my perspective.
That makes a ton of sense.
I have a lot of questions around mutual currency as well. It's really interesting, and I think an important thing for everyone to kind of be aware of is where we're at right now is experimenting on very small scales. So I think that's a point that Griff mentions, and having these kind of like constellations of currencies with liquidity between them could potentially enable like larger loans for various things, houses or industry or whatnot. But in the early days of this experimentation of implementing these currencies on blockchain, they're probably going to start very small scale, because we need to experiment, we need to learn, and there will ultimately be mistakes, failures, and this is, I think, something we haven't touched on yet, is the token engineering aspect of these currencies is really, really important. So we are, modeling these systems, simulating these systems, and every time we implement in a small field test, we can feed back that data, those learnings into the model, and improve our designs for the next time. So that's, I think, a really important aspect of the common stack approach. Is this is all engineering, modeling, and learning from real world mistakes, and being able to improve with each successive iteration.
And how much what's it take to jumpstart like this community that we're talking about in Kenya? How much what's the cost to back it up and kind of get a small economy like that jump started?
Yeah, I mean, when we first started this stuff, we didn't back it with anything at all. It was just one of these kind of mutual credit systems where each business just started with a certain amount as part of the network, and they would back it with goods and services. And the problem was with those things, they didn't scale very well, because there would always be this case where you trusted that this was like the backing of the community, but then that business breaks down, or they move somewhere else, and you end up with a lot of like kind of traffic jams where they only accept the currency on Tuesday, and then everyone just starts accepting it only on Tuesday, and then someone else says, oh, I only want it on Wednesday, and you end up with a lot of problems like that. So adding these collateral funds, these kind of reserves, was a way of sort of like creating this kind of liquidity buffer system, like saying, it's sort of like our off ramp on the freeway kind of thing. Like, okay, let's get some of the traffic off right now, and then it can come back on later. And so the bonding curve in a way was sort of a solution for dealing with, that sort of traffic jam of kind of how mutual credits tend to stagnate in some cases. But and so literally for communities right now, Red Cross is coming in and supporting them with about $100. And that's something that these community groups can raise also on their own, right? So like, as much as we're able to seed communities, that's what we're doing right now. But the hope is that, this is just a public utility. It's essentially like a financial instrument. So if you as a community, like they're a typical savings group in Kenya, like they have anywhere from, $100 up to $1,000 at any given time. And so for them to say, okay, we're going to put 10% of that into this trust that we hold, and we're going to create shares of that trust together. It's not inconceivable for the community groups to be just doing that themselves. And so, I mean, that's basically the idea of, there's some minimal kind of size that we're looking at right now, in terms of how big is our leverage compared to that liquidity, right? So like, what's sort of like the liquidity risk associated with, like, if you were just to do it with $10, right? $10 of collateral. Well, how many tokens are you going to create based on that $10? So there's some math, there's some of the modeling that we need to really work on that case. But so far, that's about the amount we're doing right now. And so, there's something like, I think it's about $4,000 of tokens for in circulation that have done about $200,000 of trade, this last year right now. And, the goal is, I mean, that's obviously just pilot kind of level stuff, but, the goal is to sort of modularize that and make it available for anybody to use in different ways and to create standards around it, right? So if you're, it's a smart contract, you could do whatever you want with it, but if you want Red Cross to support it, then there's got to be some standards around that. So developing, what are those standards? What are the systems, that need to be in place? How much leverage, is it going to be 20x or, a 1% reserve ratio with a 100x, multiplier, like that's going to be a really volatile system. And, Red Cross or, WFP or something is probably not going to want to support such systems. So that's the next stages of really standardizing a lot of this stuff and modeling it.
How much support from Red Cross is there currently? Are they big backers of this idea, or is it kind of a small wing or what's that look like?
We just got a grant from the Norwegian government. It's called Innovation Norway, and so Red Cross raises capital, right? They're not like a necessarily a government or something like that are raising taxes. So they do calls and grants. So Red Cross has to raise all their money. So Red Cross applied to Innovation Norway, the Norwegian government, to basically fund the development of the platform and the smart contracts and all the stuff associated with it. And that was about $1.6 million. So that was, as far as these things go, that's a huge amount of money being raised for something like community currencies, right? It's not even a topic for most aid organizations at all. So just bringing it into the light, and just saying, hey, we've got some money to work on the modeling, to work on the software development, to do feasibility studies and testing, in different countries and roll this out over the next kind of 2 years is huge. It's been awesome. In my entire time, I started doing this stuff really about like 20 years ago, at least studying it in the US, and then about 10 years ago here in Kenya, and, raising a few $1,000s to print, a mutual credit and stuff like that, it was like pulling teeth. Like, what are you doing? Like, you're printing money in another country? What? Like, why would you do that? And so it's starting to become almost something that people can, grok, if you will, that, like, oh, okay, yeah, like people need money. I was just recently in London at a conference for, it's CVA, cash and voucher assistance. So there's Oxfam and all these big, NGOs and there, and they're all talking about how they're just, their process of how do they dump money on communities. That's the new method of aid anyways. And I kind of stand up and I'm like, well, why are you importing foreign money into these countries? Like, why can't they make their own? Why are you doing that? And they're like, what do you mean? Like, well, I mean, where's money coming from? Why are you importing money from these other countries into that country? Like, don't they have a way to make their own money? And I'm just trying to start that conversation with them, around this stuff. And they're like, oh, well, then we'd have to like deal with national banks and all these things. And it says, oh, well, there's another way, like people can actually make their own money, right? And they're like, ding, 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 light bulb, there's this question mark of like, are you crazy? What are you talking about? But at the same time, it's like, the Bitcoin and all this, like the history of the last just decade, last few years really of people just becoming aware that currency is a tool that we can design, is starting to become mainstream. And Red Cross pushing this out across the world is going to be a huge eye opener for the next 2 billion people with their very first smartphone that are, using the blockchain natively from the time they were 5 years old, like, whoa, right? Like those guys are probably going to leapfrog all of us in North America, even Jeff in Canada. Like are you in North America? Yeah, I'm really excited about that. I'm really happy about this sort of like next generation of things kind of blooming out, and all these questions of like, is this a security? Is this, how is it regulated in the US? By the time, this stuff gets regulated to that degree in all these different countries, I hope, knock on wood, that, there's millions of people already using this stuff for their basic needs all over the place. And that question will be a joke. It's like, oh, can this woman buy her school fees and tomatoes? And can she trade, on this network? And like, how dare you even think about stopping her from doing that? In fact, so when they took us to jail when we first started doing this in Kenya, they basically, we had a whole petition, and all these people in Kenya came out and said, how dare you stop this woman from trading her tomatoes for school fees? Really? Like, what? How on earth can you justify that? There's no money in these communities, right? And so to stop people from creating mediums of exchange is it's a ridiculous concept. And again, we're way more regulated than the national banks are anyways, right? Or all the private banks, because you can actually see what's behind these things. So that's, I feel like, we've got the total moral high ground, and we have also the technical high ground to really just, bulldoze through and make this stuff work. So
Yeah, it's unstoppable tech. That's the best part about it, right?
Yeah, that's amazing. So is that kind of the strategy, is to work on a very small level, grassroots, with kind of local governments or communities? And if you get enough of those going, there's really no legitimate way to stop that. Is that kind of the overall strategy as far as dealing with bigger currencies and things like that?
Yeah. I mean, why would you stop it? I guess, for national governments to come in and say, well, we want you to use our currency as the reserve. Well, that would be a fun discussion to have, right? Like, okay, let's start to having competition on what reserve these communities are going to be using. And, let's start having, like, oh, great. This is the Kenyan government want to start producing a blockchain token as their national currency and make it transparent. Oh my God, that would end a huge amount of corruption in the country. It would be amazing, right? So like, those are the kinds of things of like, well, okay, how do you want to regulate us? Because as soon as we start having those discussions, we've already basically won to some degree. I mean, and, of course, Kenya versus Ethiopia versus, Malawi, they can all, all we really need is our foot in the door in a few of these countries. And, for them to push out Red Cross, for instance, trying to do these is kind of ridiculous. Like we're trying to help people, and it's all above the table, right? There's nothing hidden here. We're not, this is all nonprofit. There's no, some big corporation trying to suck money from people or anything like that. And you can see where all the money's going anyway. So yeah, I feel like it's unstoppable. I'm unstoppable. They're not going to stop me. I'm just going to keep doing this stuff. So
yeah, totally agreed. And I think, by the time governments may get involved to that level, they may be interested in supporting this as well. The Red Cross right now is providing that seed funding, but imagine if the government of Canada or the US or whatever government is interested in supporting local communities to provide for themselves. It's kind of like a new form of impact investment where you can support bottom-up entrepreneurialism, food growth. You can do all sorts of things with this technology to support communities to solve their own problems. So we don't have these, massive government tax pools that need to be allocated on blah, blah, blah. It's the communities that are providing for their own needs, and governments can directly support them through these mechanisms.
Yeah, that's big picture. Let's zoom in a little bit back to like the boots on the ground with the small communities. You mentioned a little bit with the survey and kind of the change in feelings that people have around this money. What are the other big changes you've seen within these communities, or what's kind of the main change or positive benefit they're getting from using these the currency like this?
Yeah, it's more circulation, it's more exchange going on, it's connection between people. A lot of people pay off a lot of their informal debt with it. One thing that was surprising was a lot of churches have started using it as their sadaka, which is like their offerings, because their pastors can't run away with the money anymore. They have to spend it again locally. So there's a lot of, just weird little stuff. Just the other week, there was one of these communities that just hosted a checkers tournament with them. And this is the month of starvation in Kenya. And so like to have, January is usually a really, really bad month. And so to have this sort of like checkers tournament going on in this worst month, and everyone they paid, I think it was like 50 shillings worth of, the tokens to sign up and go. And they're really serious about checkers here. And they're really good. I mean, I don't even stand a chance. I lost my first in the first round, but, and they had this big payout. So in a way, it's sort of like, like in the midst of all this crisis and stuff going on, they can still basically have fun and support each other and like do communal activities when they couldn't before. I mean, with Red Cross in particular, like they were doing these cash transfer programs for years in some of these communities that we're in. And this is kind of how we got connected with Red Cross in the first place, was that they were trying to get people to, train them and do kind of collective farming work. And they were paying them to do this collective farming. And after about 4 years, they just stopped paying them because the money ran out, and all the collective farming stopped because they had just trained people that, that was the method. And so what they've done, these community groups have created these community currencies. They've backed them, like there's cooperative maize mills, to grind flour and stuff like that. So they basically, as the money collects within these cooperatives, they pay themselves to do cooperative farming work on land together. And everyone can use those currencies back at the maize mill and everyone in the network. So it's given them a way to create sustainable finance for themselves, to, have a medium of exchange and work together. So a lot of those, early sort of like tribal practices of helping each other. And you can see some of that stuff coming back. And, women are generally the ones who are running these systems. I think we're well over, 60 or 70% women running these things. And they get it. I mean, they're the networkers. They're the ones doing these savings groups and everything. And so there's been this really, interesting push around the women kind of taking charge in these communities. So I don't know. It's all super interesting stuff. We have, every once in a while we get like an anthropologist to come and stay in these communities. So, if anyone's interested in coming and doing that stuff, those are the kinds of stories that, you have to live with a family for a few months and do, logbooks of what they're spending and, how has it changed the value. That to me is the really interesting stuff. I mean, we look at the data a lot and, we're there in the communities, but like those are the real fun impact stories, like how is this really changing their lives and how do they look at money differently now? And it's just beginning too. I mean, the methodology that we're talking about of them, creating their own, CICs, these community inclusion currencies, that's really just starting now. Like from the past few years, it's been, various levels of us managing it as grassroots economics, right? Like originally it was us printing the money physically, right? And then this last year it was us creating the tokens and distributing them. Now, this year, with Red Cross, it's going to be them really creating their own for the first time, and so that's going to change things quite a bit. We're going to go. We have 12 currencies right now that are all trading with each other. We're going to probably have about 45 in the next 2 months. So that'll be crazy. That'll be really cool. And like all of these guys have been, like we've been creating a currency for their kind of community, right? As like an area currency. Well, that's kind of bullshit, right? That's not a community. That's just us sort of like, drawing a line on a map, or something like that. So like for them to now come to
how did you bootstrap that? Like, cause right now you have 11 and you say you had 11 at least at DevCon, and now you're going to go to 48. Did you just have like a training program, or how did you get so many people to start their own currency?
It's these women's groups, right? So the women's groups are sort of the backing, if you will, of the currencies, all these places. So they've been existing and using these currencies for a while. So next month, they're going to we're going to basically all the previous definitions of these 12 currencies. We're basically going to get rid of those and say, you guys now create your own. Right. So like we have one community called Miani, for instance, like we created that. It was the name for a village in that area. It grew into the next 12 villages. So they're not even in Miani, right? But they're using this Miani token. It's not their community. So now we're saying, no. Now we have the ability to let you guys just do your own thing. So what do you want to call your currency? There's going to be like, Griff 1, Griff 2, Griff 3, who knows, there's some old ones there. I mean, actually back in the day with those ones that Jeff is showing, like we would do this process where they would have local artists. They would decide what they wanted to put on them, and it was much more interactive, and we couldn't afford to like print individual currencies for every community ourselves. But now with blockchain and giving them the ability to make their own tokens, like we kind of get to go back to that now. They get to self-identify. And I think that's really cool. Like, what is a community? And, who knows? Some of them might not be physical communities. Some of them could be church communities. Some of them could be all kinds of stuff. So I'm excited about seeing, what does that ecosystem look like in the future? How do they interact with each other and all that stuff? Yeah.
So you're going to the Chamas, the Roskas.
Basically, yeah. They're going to create currencies. Yeah.
Each one of them, that's going to be the like foundation is these different channels that already exist.
Yeah.
The trusted seed. Yeah.
Exactly. So like we're going to have everything that's existing right now, we're just going to make it into like a vanilla currency. We call that Sarafu. And basically all those groups, when they create their own currency, what we're going to do initially is that anyone who trades with their currency is going to be instantly kind of pulled into their networks, but then they can also choose. So you can actually choose to join a currency or create your own. And so that'll be this brand new thing. That's probably the biggest thing this year. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that we want to roll out, like voting systems, like getting them to do self-taxation and then voting on where those taxes go, for instance, and all this stuff that we've talked about, with Common Stack and stuff too. I mean, there's so much, but I think that's probably going to be one of the biggest ones this year, of just you get to make your own currencies now. What does that mean now? Like, and also like the ownership of it, like the ownership of the reserve and all that stuff, like it becomes much more tangible and real all of a sudden. Yeah. Exciting stuff.
Yeah, this is amazing. What do you see? Let's go like maybe if this continues to grow and proliferate, do you see it kind of communities popping up all over the different continents and things like that, and then kind of a mid layer of communities like of kind of all stable tokens that sit on top of that, and then national currencies on top of that? Or what do you think long term? How does it scale if it were to scale globally? What's that look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I like right now the hope is that maybe there will be some national currencies that come in, but we've been looking at like what kind of reserves, DAI is starting to do a multi-collateral DAI, I think anytime now, and then there's things like Open Libra, which are similar in some ways. So who knows, in the next few years. I mean, hopefully national governments start to, get into this and start making their own reserve currencies and stuff like that. But that, that system of like, what do we use as reserve and all that stuff is also dependent on payment rails, right? So like we're using, like, if you've heard of, what is it called? Wire right now as part of our payment rails. Sempo is the organization that's doing some of the platform, the open source platform we're using. And they're also working on the payment rails for like into e-money in Kenya, for instance. Like, how do you actually connect all these systems? Like, what are those rails that we need to build? And so how do you build that? Like if you in Boulder or Santa Cruz want to create one of these currencies in California, well, what are the rails? Like, how do you actually do that? Are you going to use a Coinbase account and use a USDT, for instance, or who knows?
That's always the challenge is how do we, it's like we can do all sorts of cool stuff in the crypto space, but in the end, 99.9% of the value that exists is controlled by these gateways to the fiat system. And basically need a partner in every country. We're working with a group called Alibre in Mexico, and they could provide a last mile solution. That's what they call it in a world, the last mile, right? How to get money in someone's bank account, because that's real money, unfortunately. So we have a group with Giveth. We're working with Alibre, and they can provide it. And in Kenya, you'll need your own solution with, it sounds like Sempo and Wire and those guys. And in the States, you can use Coinbase or BitPay or whoever. And the challenge with going global with this stuff is the same challenge that every fintech company has with expansion. You have to have partnership after partnership after partnership, and lawyers and blah, blah, blah. It's tough.
And I think that's also, in today's day and age, this kind of money hasn't proliferated yet to the extent that, I can't wait for the day that I can pay off my credit card bill with Bitcoin. I just rack up my money is already digital, right? We go around, we use our credit cards, we use our debit cards. If I could just pay that off with crypto, that's last mile right there. That's, not necessarily coming anytime soon. There's all sorts of regulation and volatility in the space. But I think, long term, we're looking at redefining wealth creation, redefining economics to be more like ecological systems. And when you asked about, currencies, how do these currencies kind of like scale up? The way we look at it in the common stack is each currency, each community is kind of like a cell. So it's, it's got internal governance processes, it's got internal circulation of value. The augmented bonding curve is kind of this permeable, semi-permeable membrane around this economy, and value can flow in and value can flow out. But, cells came together of their own accord. There was no top-down creator that designed a human, right? We started out as single-celled life forms. It became useful for these cells to start to work together. Then some cells specialized into organs and different things. And now we have this higher level, organization of cells called a human, or any animal. You have specialization of specific cells. And I think this is a long-term how these kind of economic systems will proliferate is they will federate, not necessarily growing to be like one mass cell. We don't need a worldwide cell. We don't need a national size cell. We can have community cells that then federate to larger levels, maybe regions, maybe provinces, maybe national, maybe global. And of course, that's an incredibly complex process that is way down the line. But I think that's how these kinds of experiments scale up in the long term.
Yeah,
this is. Go ahead, Will.
Oh, I just think that's a great take. That's something you hit on earlier. Basically, this idea of also building like that with all these cells interacting as they need to makes it less systemic risk. Something that you hit on earlier. So yeah, the idea of predicting the future, what we need to do to get national currencies to support in some way is probably the incorrect way to think about it. It's about continuing to find which pieces fit together so you have this really complex system, but that isn't some single point of failure that you missed because you tried to plan it. So yeah. Anyway, go ahead,
and I mean, this is one of the challenges we have with centralized governance, with one giant government that has to make all the decisions about all of the things. Elinor Ostrom's partner, actually, Vincent Ostrom, came up with really promoted this idea of polycentric governance, which is a value of the common stack and a design value that we want to push, where it's like people shouldn't be voting on all of the things all of the time. We should have groups of people who have skin in the game, stakeholders that care about this cause a lot. And that's open, that anyone can join if they also care about it. And they are making decisions about this in their own little area. And then we have groups of these small experts in that it's permeable. Anyone can join this group and help influence the way that it goes, right? But these small groups are making lots of small decisions, and this aggregates, just like in Jeff's example of a human body. Each cell has a nucleus. They all have agency, and they can make decisions for themselves in their cellular way about what they want to do and how they want to expend their energy. And this would be a huge support. Again, this would stop systemic risks that we have in our current situations, where the government of Venezuela controls everything. So they just decide one day, hey, we're going to, everyone should probably just leave the country because it's going downhill, right? Like, and that's too much power for one person or for one small group of people to control all of the public goods in all of society for this giant area of the world. Each public good could have their own governance system, or multiple competing governance systems that are trying to provide that public good, and they are funded by the community in a voluntary way. That's kind of the dream world that the Common Stack wants to create, where basically you could have any public good have its own local government, and they're incentivized to provide that public good for society. And if they do a good job, the people who are participating actually can be rewarded for their good work. And then you just have lots of those working together to provide public goods for society as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. What a beautiful concept. This is amazing to just consider the opportunity of to unlock so much human potential with these ideas that all of you are talking about. It's really, really cool. I would like to hit on, because I'd be remiss if I didn't on the Telos podcast, talk about seeds and EZAR token. Do you have takes on that, or any of you working together with either of those projects? And yeah, what's that look like?
Yeah, I've been speaking with Seeds and Reiki about that for, I don't know when I came across it, months ago now, maybe 6 months ago or so. Really, really interesting. And also, I think also just a quick note is that a lot of the designs that the Common Stack is working on are chain agnostic. So a lot of these designs for the bonding curve, for conviction voting, different governance mechanisms could be deployed on EOS, Ethereum, holochain. So a lot of the design principles may change a little bit, whether you're data-centric or agent-centric architectures, but they are definitely deployable on multiple chains. So I've been chatting with Reiki. I think they're looking to implement conviction voting as a governance mechanism in Seeds. Super cool. Actually, Seeds is another great example of one of these kind of community currencies. This is a regenerative currency where they have people who are interested in using seeds and businesses that are interested in receiving seeds. And basically, you kind of enter into an implicit contract when you use a currency. Money is not neutral. A lot of our bank debt-based money actually has kind of this colonialist, extractivist past behind it. A lot of the value that's held within our current monetary system is from resources mined in the global south under unfair working conditions and so on and so forth. So there's kind of this underlying morality of currencies, and Seeds is a great example of a currency that's looking to redefine that. So when you have Seeds, it means that you have done regenerative work for the environment, whether that's planting trees or working at a farmer's co-op, or it's kind of redefining the issuance of currency, and then consolidating this group of businesses who want to receive this as well, which is similar to what Will does in rural Kenya in a local setting. Of course, the situation changes a little bit when you're trying to do this globally and online, but it's a very interesting experiment in regenerative currencies for sure.
Absolutely.
And what was the other currency you mentioned? I don't think I've heard of that.
EZAR is a stable token in Africa. It's in
cool.
Maybe, you know what? I shouldn't guess. It's a stable token in Africa, and it's Rory Mapstone, I believe.
Okay, how do you spell that?
EZAR token. Mm-hmm. So
cool. I'll look into that.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been what a wonderful concept to get out to the world. I hope that a lot of people, I think that this is deeply interesting. I hope a lot of people find it the same way. So let's go around and kind of give any final topics. We can talk longer if you'd like. Any final topics you have, and kind of your final thoughts. So you could start there, Jeff.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess what essentially what we're trying to do with the Common Stack is redefine value. I guess that's what cryptocurrencies do in general, is they invite us to redefine value. And we want to see good people rewarded for doing good things. And that, in the international aid space, or in the open source space, or in the community participation space, we see a ton of amazing effort that goes unvalued in today's economies. And we basically want to create currency systems that can value the good work from good people, because we don't see profit as this sole extractive market mechanism. It's security for the future. And if we rely on good work to be done in this world by people who sacrifice their financial means through donations, I could donate all my money today, I'm sure it would go to great work, but then tomorrow I have no more to give. And this is kind of the issue of aid organizations today is, and Will mentioned, the Red Cross can support this community until the money runs out, and then it's like, oh well, what do we do now? We need to create these sustainable, and sustainable means also creating a profit, but it's a profit that we define to benefit not just the impact investor, but the community of people that's going to support. So through token engineering and proper currency design, we feel that we can realign these incentives to reward good people for doing good things. I think that's kind of the wrap up from my end.
Yeah. I mean, I just hope to see that we build models that can be on any chain. I'm excited to see what the EOS community does with Bancor, because I know Bancor's a major block producer, and they're deep in the EOS space. But I haven't, everyone's in their own little Twitter bubble, and I don't know all the cool projects that are coming out using bonding curves on top of EOS or on top of other like Tron or all these other blockchains, but it's, we all get so sucked up in like they're in our Twitter bubbles, and I'm excited to be. Common Stack is a blockchain agnostic project, and we just want to build the models for these economies so that people can provide services to their community, and as Jeff said, be rewarded for doing good work. And we're on the cusp of something huge, right? It's just the ability to model economies and design economies in such robust ways. This is like the beginning of a very young science that we're calling token engineering. And I'm excited to see how it develops. And I think it's a great opportunity for anyone at home to really dive in and start learning about these new crypto economic tools like token bonding curves, Harburger tax. There's a lot of interesting things going on with DeFi and the ability to send interest from one place to another, like a lossless donation. There's so many people innovating in this space. We're lucky to have met Will Ruddick is one of the major ones, one of the ones I'm most impressed with. Whenever someone asks me what's the like best bonding curve project out there, it's not even a competition. It's hands down grassroots economics. And to see people start using these tools to really change the world is blowing my mind, and there's huge opportunity to do it. And Will's one of the few people actually making it happen.
You guys are so sweet, man. Thank you.
But you got final words, Will?
I think you guys have already said it all. It's awesome. I'm like recently I've just I'm really excited about this idea of like imagine we've got $100 million kind of market cap of thousands of community currencies around the world. And that's a bad definition maybe for these things, but still like bringing in private equity and bringing in the ability, and like me personally of just saying like, look, the community that I walked to yesterday, this little village, like they're doing some amazing stuff. And for me to go and say, look, I would like to like, put in of my own funds, like $10,000 and be able to say like, I'm holding the, like I'm part of that community. I'm a stakeholder. And then basically, if you think about like portfolios of these that are, reaching into hundreds of millions of dollars, and being able to say like to private equity, hey, here's the data, here's all the women across, 5 counties in Kenya that are doing this stuff. Like, would you like to support them? And, if you make money on this, they will have sent all their fucking kids to school for the next 2 generations. Oh my God, what the fuck? I mean, like, if we can really quantify that stuff, all these impacts, and really see them moving on blockchain and give people an opportunity to invest, I think we're going to see a huge change in how we develop, new economies and all this stuff. And we're going to need all of these tools, the Common Stack. We're going to need Giveth, times a million. We're going to need all that. So I think it's sort of converging. Everybody's needed. All hands on deck. Let's get this shit done.
That is a wonderfully beautiful note to wrap it up on. We have Will, Griff, and Jeff changing the fabric of the universe and positively affecting humanity on a daily basis. What a fantastic talk today. Thank you, gentlemen. And thank you for listening, my Telos podcast friends. Cheers.
The money is not the prime asset in life.